I never believed in anything I couldn't explain until I took the night shift at Murphy's Stop and Go on Route 47. The job listing had been posted for weeks, decent pay, flexible hours, and all I had to do was keep a convenience store running from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. After 3 months of unemployment following the factory closure, I couldn't afford to be picky. My name is Elena Vasquez, and I've always prided myself on being practical. When my friends heard where I'd be working, they exchanged those looks, you know the ones. Sarah actually grabbed my arm and said, "Elena, that place is different. People talk." I laughed it off. Small towns always have their ghost stories about the old highway stop that's been serving truckers and insomniacs since the 60s. Carl Matthews, the day manager, met me for my first shift with the enthusiasm of a man attending his own funeral. He was maybe 50, with prematurely grey hair and the kind of deep-set exhaustion that spoke of too many years in retail. The keys felt heavier than they should have when he dropped them into my palm. "Simple job," he said, walking me through the store. "Stock the shelves, work the register, keep the coffee fresh. Truckers come through, night owls grabbing snacks. Nothing complicated." He paused by the counter, his fingers drumming against the scratched Formica surface. "There are some new procedures, house rules." He pointed to a laminated sheet taped behind the register. The paper was yellowed with age, the corners curled from humidity and time. At the top, in faded black marker, someone had written night shift protocols in careful block letters. I leaned forward to read, "Never look directly at customers who don't cast shadows. If the payphone rings after midnight, do not answer. Keep all cooler doors locked after 2 a.m. If you hear knocking on the back door, ignore it completely. The coffee pot must remain on at all times. Do not leave the store between midnight and 5 a.m. for any reason. If a customer knows your name without reading your name tag, do not serve them." I stared at the list, waiting for Carl to crack a smile or explain the joke. When he didn't, I let out a nervous laugh. "Okay, very funny. Is this some kind of initiation thing for new employees?" Carl's expression didn't change. His dark eyes held mine with unsettling intensity. "Elena, I need you to understand something. These aren't suggestions. They're not pranks. Follow them exactly, without exception, and you'll be fine. Break them." He didn't finish the sentence, just shook his head slowly. "Come on, Carl, don't look at customers without shadows." What does that even mean?" "It means exactly what it says." He gathered his jacket from behind the counter, movements sharp with urgency. "I've got to get home. Margaret's making dinner." He paused at the door, one hand on the frame. "Elena, I know how it sounds, but this store has been here for 60 years. Those rules have been here almost as long. There's a reason for that." The door chimed as he left, and suddenly I was alone with the fluorescent buzz of overhead lights and the distant hum of the highway. The store felt impossibly quiet, despite the constant electrical drone. Through the large front windows, Route 47 stretched into darkness in both directions, an endless ribbon of cracked asphalt disappearing into pine forests that pressed close to the road like curious observers. I walked the aisles, familiarizing myself with the layout. Standard convenience store fare, chips, candy, energy drinks, automotive supplies. The coolers along the back wall hummed contentedly, filled with beer, soda, and energy drinks. Everything seemed normal, aggressively ordinary. But as the night deepened and the last of the evening traffic faded away, the isolation began to press in. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows between the shelves, creating pockets of darkness that seemed deeper than they should be. Outside, the highway stretched empty in both directions, and the forest beyond the parking lot felt like a living thing, breathing in the darkness. I found myself glancing at the laminated rules more frequently than I cared to admit. When a semi-truck pulled up to the diesel pumps around midnight, I watched the driver through the window, a perfectly normal man in a flannel shirt who cast a perfectly normal shadow on the concrete. I felt ridiculous for checking, but I checked anyway. The payphone outside remained mercifully silent. The real weirdness started 43 minutes past midnight on my second night. I remember the exact time because I'd been watching the clock, counting down hours until dawn, like a prisoner marking days on a cell. Waldarte, a customer, entered with the soft chime of the door, a man in his 30s, wearing a wrinkled business suit that looked like he'd been driving for hours. Nothing unusual about that. Route 47 saw its share of late-night travelers, salesmen and shift workers, making the long haul between cities. He nodded politely and headed straight for the snack aisle. I went back to my magazine, half listening to his movements between the shelves. The cooler doors opened and closed with their familiar pneumatic hiss as he browsed the beverages. Standard late-night customer behavior. Then I glanced up and froze. In the reflection of the glass cooler doors, I could see the entire beverage aisle clearly. The fluorescent lights created perfect mirror surfaces in the glass, showing every detail. The shelves, the products, even my own face behind the counter. What I couldn't see was the customer. The cooler door hung open, apparently by itself. I could hear someone moving around, the soft scrape of shoes on linoleum, but the reflection showed only empty space. My rational mind immediately began offering explanations. Weird lighting angle, distorted glass, fatigue playing tricks on my eyes. But my hands were already reaching for the laminated rule sheet. Never look directly at customers who don't cast shadows. I forced myself to keep reading my magazine. Peripheral vision, tracking the impossible customer's movements. He, it, whatever, continued shopping with mundane normalcy, selecting a bag of chips and an energy drink. Eventually the footsteps approached the counter. Just these. Thanks. The voice was perfectly ordinary, slightly tired, with a faint southern accent. I kept my eyes fixed on the register display, ringing up the items by muscle memory. 27 years of life experience screamed that I was being ridiculous. But something deeper, some primal survival instinct honed by millions of years of evolution, kept my gaze locked on anything except the space where a customer should be standing. Money appeared on the counter. Real bills, worn and ordinary. I made change without looking up, sliding it across the scratched surface. "Have a good night," the voice said. The door chimed. Through my peripheral vision, I watched nothing walk out into the parking lot, heard a car door slam, saw headlights sweep across the store windows as an invisible vehicle pulled away. I stood there for 5 full minutes, heart hammering against my ribs, before I finally looked at the security monitor. The timestamp showed the entire transaction, but the camera had recorded me apparently talking to empty air, making change for no one, waving goodbye to a vacant doorway. At 1:47 a.m., the payphone started ringing. The sound cut through the store's constant electrical hum like a blade, sharp and insistent. I'd forgotten about the payphone, an ancient AT&T model mounted on the exterior wall, the kind you never saw anymore except in old movies and places time forgot. The ring was different from modern phones, deeper and more mechanical, each pulse echoing off the parking lot asphalt. I walked to the front window and stared at the phone through the glass. It hung innocuously on its metal cord, black bakelite gleaming under the harsh parking lot lights. Ring, ring, ring. Rule number 2 flashed in my mind. If the payphone rings after midnight, do not answer. But payphones needed coins, right? They couldn't just ring randomly. Someone had to be calling it, which meant someone had the number, which meant it was a real call that might be important. What if it was an emergency? What if someone was stranded on the highway, and this was their only way to get help? I was halfway to the door before I stopped. Something about the ringing wasn't right. The rhythm was too precise, too mechanical. And now that I was closer to the window, I could see something that made my blood turn to ice water. The phone cord wasn't connected to anything. It dangled free, swaying slightly in the night breeze, the severed end clearly visible where it should have plugged into the junction box. The ringing continued for exactly 90 seconds, then stopped as abruptly as it had started. The silence that followed felt heavier than before, charged with potential energy like the air before a thunderstorm. I backed away from the window, my reflection fragmenting across multiple panes of glass. For just a moment, in the corner of my vision, I thought I saw someone standing by the payphone, a figure in dark clothing, face obscured by shadow. But when I turned to look directly, there was nothing there except empty parking lot and the soft rustle of wind through the pine trees. I spent the rest of the night behind the counter, eyes fixed on the laminated rule sheet, no longer thinking of it as a prank or initiation ritual. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead with renewed intensity, as if something had awakened in the store's electrical system. Every shadow seemed deeper, every reflection potentially deceptive. When Carl arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, he took one look at my face and nodded, with what might have been approval or sympathy. "Good," he said simply, pocketing the keys I handed him with shaking fingers. "You're learning." Management assigned me a partner for my third night, Derek Hoffman, a temp worker from the staffing agency, who approached everything with the cocky confidence of someone who'd never encountered anything he couldn't rationalize away. Derek was maybe 25, all swagger and skepticism, the kind of guy who'd probably spent his college years debunking ghost stories and explaining away urban legends. "So you're the one who believes in the spooky rules," he said, reading the laminated sheet with obvious amusement. "What's next, garlic around the windows? Salt circles in the aisles?" I tried to explain what I'd experienced, but Derek just laughed. "Look, Elena, I get it. Night shifts mess with your head. Your brain starts making patterns where none exist. You see what you expect to see." He tapped the rule sheet with his finger. "This is just psychological manipulation. Probably something corporate cooked up to keep employees focused and paranoid enough to stay alert. Derek, I'm telling you, what you're telling me is that you let your imagination run wild. Watch and learn." At 1:30 a.m., Derek announced his intention to restock the beverages. The cooler doors had been locked since 2 a.m. as per Rule 3, but Derek produced a key ring from his pocket. Called the day manager, got the override codes. "These coolers need restocking, and I'm not going to let some stupid superstition prevent me from doing my job properly." I watched in growing horror as he unlocked the first cooler door. "Derek, don't, please. You have no idea what's going to happen. The soda sprites are going to get angry." He pulled the door wide open, cool air flowing out in visible streams. "See? Nothing. Just refrigerated air and overpriced beverages." For 30 seconds, nothing happened. Derek began transferring cases of beer from a dolly to the cooler shelves, movements efficient and professional. I started to wonder if maybe he was right. If I really had been letting my imagination, the handprint appeared on the inside of the glass door. Not a smudge or condensation pattern, a clear, distinct handprint pressed against the interior surface of the door, as if someone inside the cooler had placed their palm against the glass. The print was too large to be human, fingers elongated and thin, leaving wet streaks that didn't behave like normal condensation. Derek saw it too. His hand stopped moving, a case of beer frozen halfway to the shelf. That's just moisture, temperature differential, basic physics." But his voice had lost its confident edge. The handprint remained visible for exactly 10 seconds before fading, leaving only the faintest outline on the glass. As it disappeared, every fluorescent light in the store flickered in unison, a strobing effect that sent shadows dancing between the aisles. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many seconds. Our breath became visible in sharp puffs, and frost began forming on the cooler glass despite the open doors. Derek slammed the cooler shut and locked it with trembling fingers, but the damage was done. Something had been awakened. At 3:17 a.m., the knocking started, soft at first, almost polite, the sound of knuckles rapping gently on wood. It came from the back door, the employee entrance that led to the storage room and the dumpster area behind the store. 3 knocks, pause, 3 knocks, pause. Patient and persistent. "Someone's probably making a delivery," Derek said, but his bravado had evaporated. He looked pale under the fluorescent lights, and I noticed his shadow seemed to lag behind his movements by just a fraction of a second, subtle enough that he probably didn't realize it himself. Derek, Rule 4. We ignore it. That's insane. What if it's an emergency? What if someone needs help? The knocking continued, slightly louder now. Derek was already moving toward the back of the store. I'm not going to let someone freeze to death because of some paranoid list. I followed him, trying to grab his arm, but he shrugged me off. The knocking grew more insistent as we approached the back door, no longer polite requests but demanding summons. Derek's hand was on the deadbolt before I could stop him. "Derek, please?" He turned the lock and pulled the door open. The loading dock stretched empty under a single security light, shadows pooling around the dumpster and chain-link fence that separated the store property from the pine forest. No one stood on the concrete platform. No delivery truck waited in the alley. Nothing moved except scraps of paper stirred by the wind. See? Nothing there. Just wind, maybe an animal. Derek's words died in his throat. When he turned back toward me, his shadow remained facing the open doorway. So I watched in fascination and horror as his actual shadow, the dark outline that should have moved with his body, stayed perfectly still on the loading dock concrete, as if his reflection had decided to remain outside while he came back in. Derek saw my expression and followed my gaze downward. When he realized what I was staring at, he let out a sound that wasn't quite a scream, more like air being forcibly expelled from lungs that had forgotten how to breathe. He slammed the door shut and engaged the deadbolt, but when we looked at the floor inside the store, there was no shadow at all where Derek stood. We spent the rest of the night in careful silence, Derek positioned so that overhead lights wouldn't reveal his missing shadow. Both of us acutely aware that something fundamental had shifted in the store's atmosphere. The fluorescent light seemed brighter, more aggressive, casting everything in sharp relief. The cooler motors ran louder than before, their mechanical humming taking on an almost organic quality, like breathing. When Carl arrived at dawn, Derek was already gathering his things. He mumbled something about finding different work, about the night shift not being a good fit, but his eyes kept darting to the floor where his shadow should have been. Carl watched him leave with the expression of someone who'd seen this exact scene play out many times before. How long? Carl asked me after Derek's car disappeared down Route 47. How long what? How long before his shadow comes back? If it comes back at all, I had no answer for that. I only knew that the rules weren't suggestions or psychological games. They were the only thing standing between the night shift workers and something that viewed human beings as temporary inconveniences in its own ancient routine. After Derek's encounter, I couldn't pretend this was just about following arbitrary rules anymore. Something was happening at Murphy's Stop and Go, something that had been happening for decades, and I needed to understand what I was dealing with if I was going to survive more than a few weeks on the night shift. I started my investigation in the employee break room, a cramped space behind the stockroom, with a folding table, 2 plastic chairs, and a microwave that looked older than I was. The walls were covered with the usual break room detritus, safety notices, employee schedules, a faded poster about workplace harassment that probably dated to the Clinton administration. But tucked behind the time clock, I found something more interesting. A stack of old employee logbooks, the kind retail stores used to track hours and incidents before everything went digital. The books went back years, maybe decades, their covers warped from humidity and time. I pulled the oldest one from the stack and opened it to a random page. The entry was dated September 15th, 1987, written in blue ballpoint pen, with the careful penmanship of someone who took documentation seriously. Third night. Customer came in around 2 a.m., wanted cigarettes. Seemed normal until I noticed he cast no reflection in the security mirror. Remembered the rules just in time. Looked at my shoes, made the sale. He left without incident. But I could hear him laughing in the parking lot for 10 minutes after his car drove away. The laughter came from everywhere at once. I flipped through more pages, finding similar accounts scattered throughout the book. The payphone rang for 2 hours straight last night. Mary from the day shift said the phone company disconnected that line in 1981. Something's been knocking on the back door every night this week. Jerry thinks we should call the police. I told him the police can't help with this. Customer knew my name, my full name, including my maiden name that's not on any paperwork here. Told him we were closed for inventory and locked the door until he left. Found scratches on the glass afterward, like fingernails, but too deep and too long. The coffee pot went out during my shift. Temperature dropped so fast that ice formed on the windows. When I got a new pot started, everything went back to normal. The coffee must stay on. No matter what. The entries painted a picture of night shift workers struggling to make sense of experiences that defied rational explanation. But what struck me most was the pattern, the same rules, the same supernatural encounters, the same desperate attempts to rationalize the impossible. I found an entry from 1994 that made me sit down hard in one of the plastic chairs. New girl lasted 3 nights. Sarah Morrison, just graduated from high school. Sweet kid, needed the money for college. She answered the payphone on her 3rd shift. Manager found her car in the parking lot the next morning, keys still in the ignition, but no sign of Sarah. Police investigated, but what could they tell them? That she violated rule number 2? That she picked up a phone that shouldn't be able to ring? They ruled it a missing person case. File's still open, but Sarah's never coming back. I know because I can hear her voice sometimes, coming through the phone line when it rings. She's trying to warn the new workers, but her voice is different now, hungry. My hands were shaking as I turned the pages. Entry after entry described workers who'd broken the rules and simply vanished, leaving behind only their cars in the parking lot, and entries in logbooks that read like desperate warnings to whoever came next. But it was the final logbook that contained the most disturbing information. The cover was labeled 1972-1975 in faded black ink, and the entries inside were written in multiple hands, as if the book had been passed between workers like a shared confession. December 3rd, 1972, the highway construction crew finished the new section today. Route 47 now runs directly through what used to be Millbrook Cemetery. The state relocated most of the graves, but the old section, the part from the 1800s, was too unstable to move. They just paved over it. You can see the survey markers if you know where to look. Right where the highway curves past our parking lot. December 10th, 1972. Strange things started almost immediately after they opened the new highway section. Customers who don't show up on the security cameras, phone calls on lines that aren't connected. The temperature drops in the store for no reason. Management thinks it's just the building settling, but Margaret in accounting found the original construction reports. They built this store on the edge of the old cemetery grounds. We're literally sitting on top of graves that were never moved. December 24th, 1972. The rules appeared overnight. Nobody knows who wrote them, but management decided to leave them up after 3 workers quit in the same week. The rules work somehow. Follow them exactly and the incidents remain manageable. Break them and the entry ended there, the pen trailing off mid-sentence, as if the writer had been interrupted. The final entry in the book was dated January 15th, 1973, written in a different hand entirely. My name is Margaret Vance, I'm the night manager, and I've been here since the store opened. I need whoever reads this to understand, this isn't a normal place. It never was. The highway disturbed something when they built it through the cemetery, and that something has been trying to reclaim its territory ever since. The store exists in a kind of buffer zone between the world of the living and whatever lies beneath the asphalt of Route 47. The rules aren't arbitrary. They're a negotiated treaty, a set of boundaries that keep both sides in their proper places. Break the rules and you're no longer protected by the treaty. You become fair game. The dead don't rest easy when you build roads through their bones, and they get hungry waiting for someone to make a mistake. I closed the logbook and sat in the break room's harsh fluorescent light, processing what I'd learned. Murphy's Stop and Go wasn't just a convenience store. It was a way station, a neutral ground in an ongoing territorial dispute between the living and the dead. The rules weren't protection from supernatural forces. They were the terms of a ceasefire that had been in effect for over 50 years. And I was one of the soldiers stationed on the front lines, whether I'd volunteered for the duty or not. The coffee pot in the break room gurgled and hissed, its red power light glowing like a tiny beacon in the darkness. I understood now why it had to stay on, not just in the main store but everywhere. The warmth, the light, the signs of active human presence were part of the treaty terms. As long as we maintained our side of the bargain, the dead would maintain theirs. But treaties could be broken. And when they were, people disappeared, leaving only their cars in the parking lot and warning entries in logbooks that nobody in management would ever read. I walked back to the main store with new eyes, seeing it now as what it really was, not a workplace but a fortress. And my shift had just begun. Mrs. Margaret Vance appeared on my 5th night, like a ghost materializing from memory. I'd just finished reading her entry from the 1973 logbook when the door chimed softly and she walked in, a woman in her 70s with silver, hair pulled back in a neat bun, and eyes that held too much knowledge for comfort. She moved through the store with the familiarity of someone who'd walked these aisles countless times before, selecting nothing but observing everything. Her fingers traced along shelves with unconscious precision, as if she were checking that items remained in their proper places. When she reached the counter, she poured herself a cup of coffee from the pot I'd just refreshed and settled into the plastic chair customers sometimes used while waiting for lottery tickets. "You're Elena," she said. It wasn't a question. You've been reading the old books. I nodded, not trusting my voice. Up close, Mrs. Vance looked exactly as I'd imagined from her logbook entries. Sharp-eyed and competent, but carrying the weight of someone who'd seen too much and understood more than she could ever explain to anyone else. I worked here in 72 and 73, she continued, sipping her coffee as if we were having a perfectly normal conversation. I was the night manager when they opened the new highway section. I was here when the rules first appeared. You wrote some of those entries. I recognized your handwriting. I wrote the last ones. Her smile was sad and tired. The ones that came after we realized what we were dealing with. The ones that came after we lost Jenny Morrison to the payphone and David Chen to the back door. I kept writing until I couldn't anymore. What happened? Why did you leave? Mrs. Vance was quiet for a long moment, staring into her coffee cup, as if it held answers to questions I hadn't learned to ask yet. I didn't leave voluntarily, dear. I made a mistake. I broke rule number 7. I remembered. If a customer knows your name without reading your name tag, do not serve them. It was February 1973, middle of a blizzard. Customer came in around 3 a.m. Young man, maybe 20, wearing a suit that was soaking wet despite the snow outside. He knew my name, knew things about my family that weren't in any public records, but he looked so cold, so lost. I thought maybe he was from town. Maybe I just didn't recognize him. She shook her head slowly. I sold him a pack of cigarettes and a cup of coffee. He thanked me by name, my full name, including my maiden name, and left. What happened then? Nothing at first. He drove away and I finished my shift. But when I got home, my reflection wasn't quite right anymore. Little things at first, shadows falling the wrong direction, mirrors showing me a split second behind my actual movements. Then it got worse. I'd catch glimpses of that customer in reflective surfaces, standing just behind me, always just out of direct sight. Mrs. Vance rolled up her left sleeve, revealing a forearm crisscrossed with thin white scars. I tried to explain it to my husband, to my doctor, to anyone who would listen. They thought I was having a breakdown. Maybe I was, but the scratches were real enough. Every morning, new ones, like something had been trying to write messages on my skin while I slept. The messages. What did they say? Names. The names of everyone who'd worked the night shift and disappeared. Jenny Morrison. David Chen. Others from before the store started keeping detailed records. And at the bottom of each list, my own name, getting clearer and deeper each day. I felt cold spreading through my chest. How did you make it stop? I didn't. I learned to live with it. The scratches stopped appearing after about 6 months, but I never worked another night shift anywhere. Couldn't trust myself around mirrors or windows after dark. Still can't, really. She finished her coffee and stood up slowly, movements careful and deliberate. But I come here sometimes, when I can tell someone new is working nights, to offer what help I can. Mrs. Vance, I need to know, what exactly are we dealing with here? The logbooks talk about the cemetery, about the highway construction, but what's actually underneath Route 47? Her expression grew distant, as if she were looking through the store walls into some deeper darkness. Millbrook Cemetery was established in 1847, but the burial ground is much older than that. The Lenape used this area as a crossing point between seasonal hunting grounds for centuries before European settlement. When people die in places of transition, crossroads, river fords, mountain passes, sometimes they get confused about where they're supposed to go next. So the dead from the cemetery are what's causing the problems. Oh, honey, no. The cemetery dead are just the most recent layer. Route 47 cuts through what the Lenape called a thin place, somewhere the boundary between worlds was already fragile. Building a highway through it, disturbing all those old graves, that just made things worse. What you're dealing with isn't just the spirits of people buried in Millbrook Cemetery. It's everything that's been trying to cross over at this spot for the last 300 years. The fluorescent lights flickered as she spoke, and I noticed the temperature in the store had dropped several degrees. Mrs. Vance noticed too, glancing up at the lights with an expression of mild concern. I should go. My presence here makes things unstable. The boundary recognizes me as someone who's already been claimed in a way. Too much contact with me could weaken the protections the rules provide. She walked toward the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. Eleanor, listen to me very carefully. The rules work because they establish clear boundaries. What you will and won't do, what they can and can't ask of you. But the entities on the other side of those boundaries are patient. They learn. They adapt. The rules that worked in 1973 might not be enough forever. What do you mean? I mean, pay attention to patterns. If the same type of incident starts happening repeatedly, if the supernatural activity starts escalating, despite perfect rule adherence, that might mean they've found a loophole. The rules might need updating. How would I even do that? Mrs. Vance's smile was gentle but deeply sad. The same way the original rules appeared, dear. You'll know when the time comes. The store will tell you what it needs. She walked out into the parking lot, and I watched through the window as she climbed into an old sedan and drove slowly away. Headlights disappearing down Route 47 toward town. But when I checked the security monitor to review the footage of our conversation, the recording showed me sitting alone in the store, talking animatedly to an empty chair. Mrs. Vance had been there. I had the coffee cup to prove it, still warm on the counter where she'd left it. But whatever she was now, whatever crossing the boundary had made of her, it wasn't something the electronic systems could detect. I spent the rest of the night thinking about her words, about boundaries and loopholes, and the possibility that the rules I'd been following so carefully might not be permanent protection. The idea that the supernatural forces could learn and adapt was more terrifying than anything I'd experienced so far. Because if they were learning from each encounter, studying each night shift worker who came through the store, then eventually they'd figure out how to get what they wanted without technically breaking the rules. And when that happened, no amount of careful rule following would be enough to keep me safe. The test came on my 7th night and it nearly broke me. At 2:47 a.m., I heard crying outside the back door. Not the polite knocking I'd learned to ignore, but the sound of a child in distress, high, keening sobs that cut through the store's electrical hum like a blade through silk. My rational mind immediately catalogued everything wrong with the situation. No car had pulled up. The security cameras showed empty loading dock, and Rule 4 was absolutely clear about ignoring sounds from the back door. But the crying was so human, so desperate, that every maternal instinct I possessed screamed at me to help. "Please," came a small voice through the steel door. "Please, I'm lost. I can't find my mommy." I gripped the edge of the counter until my knuckles went white, forcing myself to stay in place. The rules existed for good reasons. Mrs. Vance's warnings echoed in my memory. Boundaries must be maintained. Treaties must be honored. Loopholes must not be exploited. The crying intensified, joined now by weak knocking, not the confident rapping I'd heard before, but the feeble tapping of small fists against metal. "Hello, is anyone there? I'm scared." Every fiber of my being wanted to open that door. How could I ignore a frightened child? What kind of person had I become that I could listen to crying and do nothing? The voice was so young, so genuinely terrified, that my hand was reaching for the door keys before I caught myself. I forced myself to walk to the security monitor instead. The back dock remained empty under the harsh floodlights, nothing but concrete and shadows, and the chain-link fence separating the store from the pine forest. But the crying continued, growing more desperate. "Please, I'm so cold. I just want to go home." I squeezed my eyes shut and tried to block out the sound, but it seemed to bypass my ears entirely, resonating directly in my brain. The voice was changing subtly now, still a child, but with odd inflections, words drawn out just slightly too long, consonants that clicked in ways human mouths couldn't quite manage. When I opened my eyes, the security monitor showed something that made my blood freeze. A small figure stood just at the edge of the camera's range. A child in what looked like pajamas, face turned upward toward the camera lens. But the image was wrong somehow. The proportions subtly distorted like a photograph that had been stretched vertically. The child's mouth was moving and I could hear the crying. But the sounds didn't quite match the lip movements. "I can see you watching me," the voice said, and now it carried an undertone of something that definitely wasn't human. "I know you're in there. I can smell your warmth." The figure on the monitor raised one arm and waved directly at the camera. Its fingers were too long, joints bending in directions that human anatomy didn't allow. When it smiled, its teeth reflected the floodlight like polished metal. I backed away from the monitor, but I could still hear the voice, no longer pretending to cry. "Elena Vasquez. 1247 Cedar Street, apartment 3B. You have a sister in Denver named Carmen, and a mother in Phoenix who calls every Sunday at 7 p.m. You're afraid of spiders, and you bite your nails when you're nervous. You broke rule number 7 3 days ago when you served coffee to Mrs. Margaret Vance. But you didn't realize it because she never introduced herself. My heart stopped. Mrs. Vance had known my name, had spoken to me as if we were old friends, but she'd never told me who she was. I'd recognized her from the logbooks, from her handwriting, but she'd never actually identified herself. I'd violated Rule 7 without realizing it. And now something was using that violation as leverage. You let me in 3 days ago. Eleanor, when you served someone whose name you didn't know but who knew yours, the boundary is already broken. The door is just a formality now. I looked around the store desperately, searching for options that didn't exist. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, and I noticed frost forming on the cooler glass despite the locked doors. The temperature was dropping rapidly, my breath becoming visible in sharp puffs. All you have to do is open the door. Let me in where it's warm. I promise I'll make it quick. The thing outside had stopped pretending to be human. Its voice was layered now, multiple tones speaking in harmony, creating words that human vocal cords couldn't produce. When I glanced at the security monitor, the small figure had moved closer to the camera, and its face was a constantly shifting mixture of features. Sometimes a child, sometimes an elderly person, sometimes something that had never been human at all. I'm coming in anyway, Elena. The door won't stop me now. Your precious rules can't protect someone who's already broken them. The back door's deadbolt began to turn on its own, metal grinding against metal with the sound of fingernails on a chalkboard. I watched in horror as the lock slowly rotated, each click echoing through the store like a countdown to execution. That's when I remembered Mrs. Vance's final words. The store will tell you what it needs. I ran to the employee break room and grabbed the newest logbook from the stack, flipping to the first blank page. My hands shook as I wrote, but the words came automatically, as if something was guiding my pen. Addendum to Night Shift Protocols. If you have unknowingly broken Rule 7, the following emergency procedure must be implemented immediately. All lights must be turned off, except the coffee pot indicator. Stand in the center of the store and recite the names of every night shift worker who has disappeared, as recorded in the employee logbooks. Do not stop reciting until sunrise, no matter what you see or hear. The moment I finished writing, the deadbolt stopped turning. The store fell silent, except for the hum of the coffee pot and the buzzing of fluorescent lights. Outside, something let out a sound of pure frustration. Not human, not animal, but the sound of a predator realizing its prey had found an unexpected escape route. I turned off every light in the store except for the red glow of the coffee pot, then stood in the center aisle and began reciting names from memory. Jenny Morrison, David Chen, Michael Torres, Sarah Williams. The list went on and on. Dozens of names scattered through decades of logbook entries. Night shift workers who'd made mistakes and vanished into whatever lay beyond Route 47's asphalt surface. As I spoke their names, I could feel their presence in the store, not threatening but protective. The disappeared workers had found a way to help, to add their strength to the boundary that kept the living and dead in their proper places. Each name I recited seemed to reinforce the store's defenses, building a wall of memory and sacrifice that even the hungry dead couldn't breach. I recited names until my voice was hoarse, until dawn light began creeping through the store windows, until Carl arrived for the morning shift and found me standing in the dark, still speaking the names of the lost. When I finally stopped, the new rule had been added to the laminated sheet behind the counter, written in my own handwriting as if it had always been there. The boundary held. The treaty remained intact. But I knew now that the rules weren't static. They were living things that grew and adapted as needed, fed by the experiences of each night shift worker who survived long enough to add their knowledge to the collective defense. I had become more than just an employee following mysterious protocols. I had become a guardian of the boundary, a keeper of the rules that kept two worlds from colliding in ways that would destroy them both. And tomorrow night, I would be back, ready to hold the line for another 8 hours. My 10th night at Murphy's Stop and Go brought the kind of supernatural storm that makes you understand why some knowledge should remain buried with the dead. The payphone started ringing at 11:43 p.m., 17 minutes before the rule said it was dangerous to answer. I noted the time carefully, having learned to track every deviation from normal patterns. The ringing was different tonight, slower, more measured, with longer pauses between bursts, as if something was trying to establish a rhythm. At midnight exactly, the ringing stopped. Then it started again at 12:01 and again at 12:02. By 12:15, the payphone was ringing continuously, each ring overlapping with the next, until it became a steady metallic shriek that penetrated the store's walls and seemed to vibrate in my bones. I stuffed paper towels in my ears, but the sound bypassed physical hearing entirely, drilling directly into my consciousness with increasing intensity. At 12:30, every phone in the store began ringing in harmony. The ancient rotary phone behind the counter that supposedly hadn't worked in years, my personal cell phone, even the electronic beeping of the credit card reader as it tried to establish a connection with something that definitely wasn't the bank's processing center. That's when I realized this wasn't just another night of routine supernatural harassment. Something had been building toward this moment, gathering strength from each small violation, each boundary test, each near miss with the rules. Tonight was going to be different. Tonight was going to be a war. The first customer arrived at 12:47 a.m. I saw him through the window, a tall man in a dark coat, walking across the parking lot with movements that were almost but not quite human. His gait was too smooth, lacking the subtle imperfections that marked living locomotion. When he reached the door, he stood motionless for several seconds before entering, as if he were calculating the precise timing required for whatever he intended to do. The door chimed, and he walked straight to the counter without browsing. Up close, his face was perfectly ordinary, middle-aged, clean-shaven, the kind of forgettable features you'd see on 1,000 commuters. But his eyes reflected the fluorescent lights like an animal's, and when he smiled, his teeth seemed to go on just slightly too long. "Pack of cigarettes," he said. His voice was normal, conversational, with a faint accent I couldn't place. "Marlboro Reds." I rang up the cigarettes without looking at him directly, following Rule 1 with practiced precision. But as I opened the register, he leaned forward and said quietly, "Hello, Elena, Rule 7. Don't serve customers who know your name without reading your name tag." "I'm sorry, but we're actually closed for inventory," I said, closing the register drawer. "You'll need to—" "Elena Vasquez," he continued as if I hadn't spoken. "Born October 15th, 1996. Social Security number 123456789. Mother's maiden name Rodriguez. The scar on your left knee from when you fell off your bicycle at age 7. Every detail was correct, including things that weren't in any database or public record. I backed away from the counter, but he just smiled wider, revealing teeth that definitely weren't human, too sharp, too numerous, arranged in rows like a shark's. You can't refuse service to someone you've already served. "Elena, Mrs. Vance was my associate, my advanced scout. When you sold her coffee, you established a relationship with our organization. The contract is already in effect." The lights in the store began flickering in sequence, creating a strobing effect that made his face appear to shift and change with each pulse. Behind him, I could see more figures entering through the front door. Customers who cast no shadows, who moved with the same unnaturally smooth gait, who all turned to look at me with eyes that reflected light in colors human eyes couldn't produce. "The rules," I whispered, clutching the counter for support. "The rules are a treaty between equals," he said, producing exact change for the cigarettes and placing it on the counter. "But you forfeited your protected status when you violated Rule 7. The treaty no longer applies to you personally, Elena. You've become what we call available inventory." More customers filled the store, their movements coordinated like a choreographed dance. They spread out through the aisles, selecting merchandise with deliberate precision, each one heading toward the counter for checkout. I realized with growing horror that they were forcing me to serve them, dozens of supernatural entities who knew my name, who had somehow used Mrs. Vance's visit to establish a legal claim on my services. The first customer completed his transaction and left, but immediately another took his place. Then another. They formed an orderly line that stretched through the store and out into the parking lot, each one purchasing a single item, each one addressing me by name, each one adding another link to whatever chain they were forging around me. "Elena, I need lottery tickets." "Elena, ring up this energy drink." Elena, do you have change for a 20? My name became a constant drone, dozens of voices speaking it in unison, creating a hypnotic rhythm that made it harder and harder to think clearly. With each transaction, I felt something essential draining away, not just energy, but autonomy, free will, the basic right to refuse service to entities that shouldn't exist. The payphone outside began ringing again, but now I could hear voices coming through the line, not the electronic simulation of speech, but actual human voices calling my name from somewhere impossibly distant. I recognized some of them from the logbook entries. Jenny Morrison, David Chen, all the night shift workers who'd disappeared over the decades. They were trying to warn me, trying to offer guidance. But their words were drowned out by the constant drone of supernatural customers demanding service. That's when I saw Derek's shadow. It stood by the payphone, separate from any physical form, gesturing frantically toward the employee break room. Derek had lost his shadow when he opened the back door, but apparently it had retained enough independence to act on its own. It was pointing repeatedly at something behind the counter, its movements becoming more urgent as the line of impossible customers grew longer. I understood. The logbooks, the emergency procedures I'd written during my 6th night. The store's accumulated knowledge of how to survive supernatural encounters that pushed beyond the normal boundaries of the rules. Between customers, I managed to grab the newest logbook and flip to the emergency addendum I'd written. Below my original entry, new text had appeared in handwriting I didn't recognize, dozens of different scripts, as if every disappeared worker had contributed their knowledge to a collective survival manual. Emergency Protocol for Treaty Violation. If supernatural entities establish service claim through Rule 7 violation, invoke the right of final service. Announce that you will complete one final transaction for each customer currently in the store, then permanently close for business. This transforms the situation from ongoing contract to terminal transaction, breaking the service claim through completion rather than refusal. I looked up at the line of customers stretching through the store. There had to be at least 30 of them, maybe more, each one waiting patiently for their turn to bind me further into whatever supernatural contract they were weaving. But if I could serve them all in a single final transaction— "Attention, customers," I called out, my voice shaking but determined. "Murphy's Stop and Go is permanently closing for business in exactly 1 hour. I will complete one final transaction for each customer currently in the store, after which no further service will be available." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Every supernatural customer in the store turned to look at me with expressions of shock and fury. The first customer, the one who'd started this whole nightmare, let out a sound like steam escaping from a ruptured pipe. "You cannot close," he hissed. "The service contract is binding. You have no authority to—" "I have the authority of the final night shift manager," I said, the words coming from knowledge I didn't know I possessed. Under the original treaty established in 1973, the night manager retains the right to permanently close operations if supernatural activity threatens the integrity of the boundary itself. The lights in the store blazed brighter, and I could feel the presence of every disappeared worker standing behind me. Jenny Morrison, David Chen, dozens of others whose names I'd recited just 3 nights before. They were lending me their strength, their accumulated knowledge, their final gift to someone who still had a chance to escape the fate that had claimed them. I began serving the final customers with mechanical efficiency, processing each transaction while maintaining the mental image of a store closing forever, of a boundary being sealed permanently, of a treaty being honored through completion rather than violation. Each sale brought me closer to freedom. Each transaction loosened the supernatural grip on my autonomy. When I rang up the last item for the last impossible customer, the store fell silent, except for the hum of the coffee pot and the buzz of fluorescent lights. The supernatural entities stood motionless for a moment, then began filing out through the front door with the same coordinated movements they'd used to enter. The first customer, their leader, apparently, paused at the door and looked back at me with something that might have been respect. "Cleverly done, Elena Vasquez. The right of final service is an old law, nearly forgotten. You have honored the treaty while escaping its consequences." He almost smiled. "We will remember this. When the store reopens under new management, we will be waiting." They left as quietly as they'd come, dissolving into shadows that flowed across the parking lot and disappeared into the pine forest beyond Route 47. I stood alone in the store, surrounded by the accumulated detritus of impossible transactions, receipts for items that had never existed, change made in currency that looked almost but not quite like real money. At exactly 6 a.m., I turned off all the lights except the coffee pot, locked the front door, and taped a handwritten sign to the window, closed permanently. Thank you for your patronage. Carl would arrive in an hour to find the store shuttered and empty, but I wouldn't be there to explain. Some boundaries once crossed couldn't be uncrossed. Some treaties once invoked changed the people who invoked them in permanent ways. I'd won the battle, but I was no longer entirely human. The right of final service had saved my life. But it had also made me something new. A guardian of closed boundaries, a keeper of sealed treaties, someone who existed in the space between the living world and whatever lay beyond Route 47's cursed asphalt. Dawn broke over Murphy's stop-and-go like a blessing I no longer deserved. I sat in my car in the parking lot, engine running but going nowhere, watching the sunrise paint the store windows gold. The building looked smaller in daylight, ordinary and shabby. Just another run-down convenience store on a lonely stretch of highway. No one driving past would suspect what had happened inside those walls. What continued to happen whenever darkness fell, and the fluorescent lights became beacons for things that shouldn't exist. Carl's pickup truck pulled into the lot at exactly 7 a.m., just as it had every morning for the past 10 days. I watched him approach the store, keys jingling in his hand, then stop short when he saw my handwritten sign taped to the door. His shoulders sagged as he read it, and when he turned to look at my car, his expression held no surprise, only the weary acceptance of someone who'd seen this exact scene play out too many times before. He walked over to my driver's side window, and I rolled it down to meet his tired eyes. How long? He asked, the same question he'd asked when Derek left. The store's closed permanently. I invoked the right of final service. I handed him the keys along with the newest employee logbook. Everything's documented. The next manager will need to know what happened here. Carl flipped through the book's final pages, reading my entries with the careful attention of someone who understood their importance. When he reached the emergency protocols I'd written, he nodded slowly. Smart girl. Most people don't figure out the right of final service until it's too late. He closed the book and looked back at the darkened store. Of course, this means corporate will have to find a new location if they want to keep serving this stretch of highway. Can't rebuild on the same spot. The boundary's been permanently sealed. What about you? What happens to your job? Oh, I'll be fine. Been in retail long enough to land somewhere else. It's the night shift workers I worry about. He gestured toward the store with a tilt of his head. There's always another Murphy's stop-and-go, Elena. Always another lonely highway where the dead get restless and someone needs to stand watch. The rules change, but the job stays the same. I knew he was right. Even now, sitting in the morning sunlight, I could feel the pull of dark highways and fluorescent-lit storefronts, the call of places where the boundary between worlds wore thin, and someone needed to maintain the ancient treaties that kept both sides in their proper places. The right of final service had freed me from this particular battleground, but it had also marked me as someone who understood the rules, who could read the signs, who might be willing to take another night shift when the need arose. Elena, Carl said quietly, you saved lives last night. Not just your own. Everyone who might have worked here after you. When supernatural entities establish a permanent foothold in a location, it spreads. Other stores, other night shifts, other workers who don't know the rules. You stopped that from happening. I wanted to feel proud of what I'd accomplished, but all I felt was hollow. The victory had come at a cost I was only beginning to understand. In the rearview mirror, I could see my reflection, still recognizably me, but changed in subtle ways. My shadow fell at slightly the wrong angle, and sometimes when I blinked, I saw brief after-images of places I'd never been, highways I'd never traveled, stores I'd never worked in but somehow knew intimately. The boundary recognizes you now, Carl continued, following my gaze to the mirror. You're part of the treaty structure, like Mrs. Vance but different. She broke the rules and got claimed by the other side. You followed the rules all the way to their logical conclusion and became something new entirely, a neutral party, someone who can move between worlds without belonging fully to either. Is that supposed to be comforting? It's supposed to be honest. He stepped back from the car and shouldered his jacket. You've got choices to make now, Elena. You can try to go back to your old life, pretend this never happened, find a day job somewhere far from lonely highways. Some people manage that, though the dreams never really stop. Or you can accept what you've become and use it to help other people facing the same situation you did. There's always another Murphy's Stop and Go, always another night shift worker who needs guidance. The supernatural community knows about you now. They'll reach out when someone new needs training, needs protection, needs someone who understands the rules well enough to bend them without breaking them. I thought about Jenny Morrison and David Chen and all the other names I'd recited in the darkness, workers who'd faced the same impossible choices and hadn't been fortunate enough to discover the emergency protocols in time. How many lives could have been saved if someone had been there to guide them, to share the accumulated knowledge of decades of night shift survivors? Think about it, Carl said, walking back toward his truck. But don't think too long. This kind of work doesn't wait for anyone to be ready. I drove home through the morning traffic, radio playing songs that sounded different than they had a week ago, news reports about accidents and disappearances that I now heard with new understanding. The ordinary world continued its ordinary routines, but I could see the thin places now. Intersections where too many traffic fatalities had occurred, abandoned buildings where shadows fell at impossible angles, 24-hour businesses whose employees always seemed nervous and tired. The boundary between worlds wasn't just located at Murphy's Stop and Go, it was everywhere. A vast network of thin places and crossing points that most people never noticed, because most people were fortunate enough to work day shifts in well-lit offices where the dead stayed, properly buried. But someone had to work the night shifts, someone had to stand watch at the thin places, someone had to maintain the treaties and follow the rules and add new protocols when the old ones proved insufficient. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment complex parking lot. The caller ID showed only a number I didn't recognize, but when I answered, the voice on the other end was familiar, Mrs. Vance, though she sounded different now, more present somehow, as if our shared experience had strengthened whatever connection existed between boundary crossers. Elena, dear, I heard about last night. Word travels fast in our community. Her voice carried warmth and approval. You did something remarkable, not just surviving, but evolving the rules themselves. That takes wisdom and courage that most people never develop. Mrs. Vance, I need to ask you something. Are you still human? A long pause, filled with the kind of silence that held entire conversations. I'm something new, Elena. Something that needed to exist to help others navigate what we've all experienced. You are too now. The question is what you're going to do with that transformation. Carl mentioned there might be other stores, other workers who need help. Oh, there are dozens. Hundreds, maybe. Every highway has its thin places. Every night shift has its rules, and every worker deserves to know what they're really protecting. Her voice grew stronger, more confident. There's a network of us now. People who've crossed the boundary and come back changed. People who understand both sides of the treaty. We help where we can, when we can. But we always need more voices, more perspectives, more solutions to problems that don't fit in any normal employee handbook. Through my apartment window, I could see Route 47 in the distance, its asphalt ribbon disappearing into pine forests where shadows moved independently of their sources. Somewhere along that highway, another Murphy's Stop and Go would open within a few months, and another night shift worker would find themselves face to face with laminated rules that seemed like pranks, until the first shadowless customer walked through the door. I'll do it, I said quietly. Whatever this is, whatever I've become, I'll help. I hoped you'd say that. Mrs. Vance's smile was audible through the phone. There's a 24-hour diner outside Millerville that's been having incidents. The night waitress quit last week and management is getting desperate. They need someone who understands the rules, someone who can help the new hire survive long enough to learn what they're really dealing with. I looked at my reflection in the apartment window, still recognizably Elena Vasquez, but marked now with the subtle changes that came with crossing boundaries and surviving the crossing. My shadow fell at the correct angle in daylight, but I knew that would change when darkness fell. I'd become something new, something necessary, something that existed to help others navigate the thin places where the living and dead negotiated their eternal, uneasy peace. When do I start? I asked, The sun climbed higher over the highway, burning away the shadows where impossible things hid during daylight hours. But night would come again, as it always did. And when it did, someone would need to stand watch at the thin places. Someone would need to follow the rules. Someone would need to add new ones when the old ones weren't enough. And now, for better or worse, that someone included me.